Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where in the world you're joining us from. My name is Marietje Schaake. I'm the International Policy Director at the Stanford Cyber Policy Center, and it's our pleasure to welcome you to our weekly webinar. It's one in a series today that will focus on cyber peace, which I'll say a little bit more about in a second. But thank you first and foremost for joining us. I know this is a Zoom-filled period in our lives, and it means a lot that you are spending an hour with us to discuss a topic that I think has not received the attention that it should have amidst the pandemic. Of course, everybody has a lot on their minds between public health, the economic concerns, and political tensions that are filling the headlines and causing a lot of concern for people to talk about at the kitchen table. But unseen and also escalating amidst this pandemic are hybrid conflicts, cyber attacks, and exploitations of the fact that so many of us are essentially living online. And those who are exploiting this opportunity can be criminals, can be state actors, they can have a geopolitical motive, they may have a political motive or a commercial motive, but the sort of Wild West that is emerging in the space of cyber conflict should probably best be counterbalanced with an emphasis on cyber peace. And that's why I'm so happy to welcome today two distinguished speakers. Firstly, we will hear from Stéphane Duguin. He's the Chief Operating Officer of the Cyber Peace Institute. It's a newly established not-for-profit housed in Geneva that focuses on protecting vulnerable communities that could be the victim of cyber attacks, analyzing these attacks and pushing for responsible behavior and the advancement of international law. And in the interest of transparency, full disclosure, and to give you a comprehensive view of my role, I also wear the hat of president of that NGO, besides the work that I do at Stanford. So I work with Stéphane, but I will ask tough questions anyway, and I'll invite you to do the same after he introduces his introductory remarks, and then we'll go to Camille François, who serves on the advisory board of the Cyber Peace Institute, but also is the Chief Innovation Officer at a company called Graphica that looks at disinformation, coordinated inauthentic behavior. And their work has really been instrumental in understanding, for example, foreign interference in the democratic and election processes, and really uncovering some of the unseen harms of people manipulating information flows and trying to change people's minds in ways that we need to shed more light on. So I could not think of two better speakers to talk about cyber peace. Camille has also thought a lot about cyber peace, and I'm very, very happy that she could join as well. So just a few practical points on how this interactive session from behind screens will work. Our guest speakers will share their introductory remarks. You can feel free to start asking questions with the Q&A function, and I will then read them out so that the speakers can focus on their own presentations and don't get too confused. However, there is an opportunity to ask a question anonymously if you wish. Otherwise, I will read out the name of the person who asked the question as well, so that it's clear that that person can be identified if they wish. Otherwise, feel free to do an anonymous question. We'll make it as interactive as possible, and we'll make sure that we end in about 55 minutes. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us. Stéphane, over to you.
Thank you, Marietje, for the kind words, and very happy to be here today. I think for introduction, I would like to go through the logic of the setup of the Cyber Peace Institute and why the focus on cyber peace and not cybersecurity or something else. It's important to look at cyber peace from, at least from our side. What we looked into is the trigger of activities and what kind of activities we put together, what is the construct in order to achieve this cyber peace. So everyone knows the basics is that there's an asymmetry today in between the capacity of the attackers, being the capacity to scale or the capacity to crowdsource activities of different attacking network left and right in the world, technological capacity or just financial resources on one end, and the capacity for victims, vulnerable population, just to defend themselves and be at the same level when it comes to this balance, to this unbalance. That's one side. The second is that the effort for the past years to address this asymmetry, this race of attack, this augmentation of irresponsible behavior is happening in an environment that is hyper politicized. So where there's a mix in between geopolitics, emotions, and incomplete or unreliable data when it comes to what is really happening. There's a lot of statement, there's a lot of call for attribution, but what do we really know about what is happening? So what we saw at the setup of the Cyberpeace Institute that is newly created, started in Geneva last September, is if we look into cyberpeace, we need to look into the building issue, which is the fundamental lack of accountability. So thinking how to close this accountability gap would help us to achieve cyberpeace. If you break it down into several pieces, it's a lot of different actors in the cyberspace, a lot of them with different capacity and resources, from state, non-state actors, academia, population using the cyberspace to create an access to knowledge. For everyone, there's a clear set of expectations and values that is there in terms of responsible behavior in the cyberspace. That's one. What are the expectations? The second bit is what are the commitments existing for all the stakeholders to uphold these obligations and to live up to these values? And then is there any mechanism to track and to verify these specific commitments? And at the end of the day, if commitments are not met, is there any, is there any reward or consequences? What is happening? So we looked into this accountability issue and what this means. And then in the Cyberpeace Institute, we decided to address this operationally through 3 sets of activities. The first one is to say, whatever we want to do, we want to make sure that we describe what is happening on the ground to populations that are impacted by cyber operations and cyber attack. So we want to be the voice, to offer a platform for victims, for individuals, for communities, just to explain what is happening to them. We don't look at attacks from the point of view of technology or finance, but what is important is the human part. This is going to create over time a testimonials of modus operandi, of victimology. And we want to be not only human-centric, but evidence-led, still thinking about accountability in order to describe these attacks from the point of view, this is happening to people, but at the same time, this is the technical reality of the attack. So in the Institute, we put in place this forensic analysis, this big data analysis of what is happening in the cyberspace in the context of these attacks. And then we want to make sure that these 2 parts of our activities can inform discussion on international law, regulations, and you can think regulation from the policy point of view, but also from the technical point of view, because changing part of the protocol of the internet, in fact, can have a way bigger impact on the whole cyberspace than discussing a norm in the GGE sometimes. So this is how we think cyberpeace, is that at the core, we need to address this accountability gap. And to address the accountability gap, we really want to move this reactivity all together, assisting vulnerable population, making sure that what we learn and what we analyze can help the technical description of the attack, and that this is understandable by policymakers or tech makers. For all of this to advance responsible behavior and hopefully to achieve cyberpeace. I try to keep it short for the opening.
Thank you so much. Very informative, nevertheless. Over to you, Camille.
Yeah, thank you, Stefan. I think that's giving me a good segue to talk a little bit perhaps about how I came to the topic of cyberpeace and sort of the historical context around it. I started working on the idea of cyberpeace a little while ago and thinking about 2 different dimensions of cyber conflict and how 2 different framing on what's happening in cyberspace kind of led to the slow creation of the accountability gap that Stefan is describing. And in this work, I look at what the slow definition of cyber war has done, and how this idea of cyber war, the cyberspace as a battleground, has done, and how that progressed sort of on a totally parallel track from a more cyber libertarian perspective that thinks that cyberspace is not a space for conflict, and it's a space in which we have to protect individuals from government. And so if you think about it sort of in this historical context, on the one hand, you have the slow development of the cyber warfare doctrine, notably in military circles, right? It's an old idea. The first definition of information warfare dates back to 1976. And here, really, the framing is the entirety of cyberspace is a new battleground, and it's going to be government against government. And that yields a set of framings, a set of vocabulary that is overly militaristic, right? This is where we inherit all this idea about what is cyber warfare, everything is a cyber attack, right? And on the other hand, sort of like at a complete different side of the spectrum, but at the same time, you have the cyber libertarian idea, which frames cyberspace as the utopia in which people gather free from the influence of government, right? And so the classic illustration of that is John Perry Barlow's Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace. He describes the governments as giants of flesh and steel. And the idea really is, cyberspace will be where society gathers absent of government. And so, of course, if you think about these two trajectories, the thing that happens, in the middle is you end up with a reality of governments actually leveraging digital means to pursue conflict against one another, but very little conversation about what are the rules for this and what are the consequences of that, right? You have one perspective, which is everything is war, and another perspective, which is governments shouldn't be part of this conversation. And therefore, the big absent is the middle one, which is what are the set of norms and legal frameworks that we have to ensure that as governments pursue conflict in cyberspace, we can protect individuals, we can protect societies, and we can hold them accountable for behaviors that are not desirable. And so that's sort of like for a little bit of a background on how we come to the situation that Stefan is describing, where we have very little instruments and set of conversations that look at who are the civil society victims and sort of collateral damages of these escalation of conflict in cyberspace, and what is the role of our own normal democratic norms and frameworks like the human rights framework in protecting these individuals in the middle of this escalation. And I think this is where the cyber peace frame is very powerful, being able to reframe this conversation saying, it doesn't have to be war. It doesn't have to raise to that level. The reality is one in which we see a growing escalation of conflict. As Stefan said, most of the collateral damages and victims of these conflicts are often not documented. And because we're kind of trapped in our definitions, which are very war and military centric, we're also in a dynamic where often we realize after, when we're facing, a new type of cyber conflict, right? So this is exactly what happened with interference. For the longest time, norms were very focused on protecting critical infrastructure, very focused on protecting tubes and networks and systems. And of course, we didn't have the more inclusive, rights-centric and society-centric conversation that would have led to more discussions on, wait, what else is going to happen as a result of the escalating conflicts between government and cyberspace? And so I really believe in the Cyber Peace Institute's mission to sort of help redefine this problem and help bring about both attention to how we grow accountability in the space, but also to, again, help bring the evidence to this is how real people's lives get impacted, right? This is how civil society organizations are trapped in this dynamic of escalating cyber conflict. I think I'll leave it at that to leave room for discussion together. One last sort of thought as we head there is another thing that's been quite powerful in this framing and in this conversation is if you define cyber peace as the collective responsibility to build peace and stability in cyberspace, then you start having really important conversations around what can other actors do? What are businesses' responsibility to ensure that they are not used to facilitate cyber conflict, right? How can technology companies behave themselves in order to continue ensuring peace and stability in cyberspace? It creates a frame and it creates a debate that's larger and more inclusive and can help us think about multiple actors' roles and responsibility in creating peace and stability in cyberspace.
Thank you so much. I think this pointing out that the victims are often people, but that when we talk about cyber and technologies and attacks and who's done it, that impact and the very human aspects of escalation of conflict in cyberspace are often lost. And the second point that I want to pick up on is the question of at least not exporting instability, right? The question of responsible behavior and advancing a rules-based international order, which the United States used to be one of the leading nations in doing. And what struck me today in looking at the news is that it was revealed that the Trump administration has given the CIA more authority to actually engage in offensive cyber attacks. And so I wanted to start with the question of how that impacts the balance of power, the perspectives of cyber peace, if we see a country like the United States openly engaging in more offensive cyber attacks. How does that change the equation, and what does it mean for the perspectives of agreement on cyber peace? I don't know who of you would like to start. Tough question, sorry.
It is a tough question. So I will first start by saying that I haven't finished reviewing everything that has been revealed, but that indeed is kind of the first part of this problem, which is traditionally the conduct of cyber operations has been really wrapped in utmost secrecy in many governments. And so there hasn't really been an open debate, sometimes for understandable reasons, about, what are capabilities that exist, what types of behavior can you expect in response to other types of behaviors from governments. And so a lot of what we know about how governments conduct offensive cyber operation is sort of like the drip of what gets revealed throughout the years. And so the secrecy is one part of the problem when we think about accountability and norms and stability. I'll leave it at that, and Stéphane, I'll let it sort of take it from here for any further thoughts on that specific revelation.
Yeah, just joining you there also to there will be the need to go through the details of the revelation itself. But again, it's sadly not something new in the context of the cyberspace in terms of you look at international law, you look at norms, you look at what are supposed to be responsible behavior, how it's documented, and the reality of activity of states from two points of view. The fact that is there any restraint to attack, the example of you're saying just right now, but is there also any living up the commitment to defend and to protect critical civil infrastructure, etc. So it's not only what you are not supposed to do, it's also what you're supposed to do. Are you really doing it in order to protect the wider construct of cyberspace? So sadly enough, this is one of the many examples where it comes to this aggregation of behavior that is undermining this the stability of the cyberspace. To go back to the comments, it's also it's how do we document that? Is how do we link this kind? Because Otherwise, we're going to be into like a train of this state is doing this and this state is doing that, and this just initiative is going to work in cyberspace. We need to be sure that we have like a capacity to document what are the reality of this behavior and or these pledges to do specific action in cyberspace or not do it. On one end, we have this documentation that is different than the documentation of norms and international law. This is really about how norms and international law are understood by the states and what they say about it. So that's the first construct. And on the other end, make sure that we also have the capacity to describe how this is impacting the life of human being. I was about to say on the ground, which is what is was important. And that, I think, would be the building blocks in order to advance the conversation in this context.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think this notion of closing the accountability gap that the Cyber Peace Institute is focusing on is one that is at a tension with a time where polarization and fragmentation globally behind multilateralism and international norms is also very much the flavor of the day. And so that brings me to the first question asked by Paul Meyer. He says, I flagged that out of 45 national submissions in response to the open-ended working group chair's, quote, pre-draft report, only one mentioned accountability. How can we persuade states to accept that an accountability mechanism is required for promoting responsible state behavior? That's the end of the question. And I think it would be helpful that for those who are on the webinar and who don't know the jargon of open-ended working group, which has been mentioned in this session, that a short explainer could be really insightful. Stefan, can I start with you for this first question?
Yes, thank you. And thank you for the question. It's a bit linked to the one of before. We looked, in fact, at that question in how we set up the capacity for the Cyber Peace Institute. It was there. The fact that there's a lack of accountability is not new. I mean, it's not like we discovered it last year and say, oh, what are we going to do about this? It's something that is very long and very pregnant to cyberspace. So we looked into what are the response so far and what could we do in order to change maybe this dynamic. As I was mentioning in the opening remarks, the approach to it is quite geopolitical. It's quite sometimes emotional. And we wanted to go out of that frame, which is a very complicated one. And Camille explained that very, very well. When you go back to historically why we land where we are. And we wanted to go into two complementary approach which are human-centric and evidence-led. Meaning that if we are very careful into looking into the impact of cyber attacks to human beings, document it, give the space to vulnerable populations in order to express their concerns, suffering, what is happening to their community, doing this over time in that scale, you create suddenly a companion of information that is not available today. So that's one. Now, when you do this, there's the risk that you're really close to bias because you're going to debrief individual, looking into what is happening in their life. So it's heavily grounded into a societal bias. So to complement, to be evidence-led and making sure that we're going to have the right partnership, first with the civil society itself or the victim themselves, industry actors, others, in order to have this companion of data to look at this from a more data-centric and forensic point of view. And having both as a portfolio of information that we can then present to policymakers, diplomats, etc., in terms of to advance your discussion. It could be good that you look into the reality of the description of what is happening in the field. And there, by doing this, you create this tension, this accountability tension, because on one hand, you have the theory, and on the other hand, you have the practice. And it's more complicated to escape the reality of the practice when it's properly documented and they're accessible for wide populations.
Thank you. Camille, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I really agree with Stefan's framing. It's an unearthing exercise on both ends, right? Unearthing the accountability mechanisms and principles that we can use to create this accountability, and unearthing the facts and then the evidence that exposes any gaps between practice and sort of stated norms and stated behaviors. I think that what's interesting is there has been many different forums over the years for where will we discuss accountability, where we will discuss how international law applies to cyber operations. And it sort of often hits sort of the same blockers. And if you look, for instance, at the discussion on how human rights apply or doesn't apply to certain areas of cyber operation, you kind of quickly realize that this isn't a conversation that has made a lot of progress. When you look at an exercise like the Tallinn Manual on international law applicable to cyber operation, which sort of created two outputs. The first output that's focused on sort of above the threshold of armed conflict, the second output that's focused on below the threshold of armed conflict, you realize that there's, like few thin pages on the role that human rights can play in guiding us in creating these norms, in guiding us in seeking accountability when we have damages and harms from this type of conflict. So I think it's interesting because in the dynamic that Stefan is describing, we also kind of know what elements seem to be missing from the table to date.
Thank you. That brings me to the next question asked by Joe Burton. He says, it's so good to see a webinar on cyber peace instead of cyber conflict, so thanks. My question, peace has historically been driven by activism, peace movements, etc. How do we encourage these bottom-up social movements to take cyber attacks seriously? And how can we involve people in responses to major cyber incidents? Thanks. I think, Stefan, I'll start with you again and then back to Camille.
Yes, a very good question. Thank you, Joe, for asking Can put that in parallel with some discussion I participated in lately. Just giving you the whole context, not going into the specific. It was organized by the World Health Organization into this whole problematic of epidemic of disinformation and misinformation, and what is possible to be done at scale in order to address it. I'm mentioning this because it's related to how do you make sure that bottom up you can have a system that is scalable in order to empower each and every consumer of information in the cyberspace to not only being a consumer, but being a co-creator of the security of everyone else. It's like when you have in the real life people explaining yourself, you need to wash your hands, etc., in order not to spread COVID-19. How do you have the same explanation in cyberspace to explain that if you forward this piece of information, it could well be that not only it's this or misinformation, but it could be it's a malware, and you're going to infect someone else. So there's this angle which is how to have a narrative that is understandable by everyone, that it's important, that it's not risk-free, or that we have to be careful to the cyberspace security of everyone, and that's also our own personal responsibility, but without also forgetting that there's an asymmetry in responsibilities. I mean, individual responsibility is important. That's the one that scale. So if we invest into digital literacy, if we invest into, I don't know how to translate this in English, but like autodefense intellectuelle, so that self-defense from your cognitive capabilities, that would help for sure at scale. But we also should not forget that government and industry have a weight that is quite different for a single individual. So bottom up for sure, but bottom up by making sure that industry, civil society, and government are also providing this space and this information and this capacity for civilian population to get it and to be in capacity to use that knowledge to be really this co-creation team to cyber security and then in the end cyber peace.
Thank you, Camille.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. The Digital Peace Now campaign has really interestingly pursued this sort of like activism angle, right? Will people rise up for peace in cyberspace? And how can we help along the way? Because it can be really abstract. And so I think a related question is, today, how do people realize that civil society individuals are also collateral damage in the escalation of cyber conflict? And here you have sort of like different ways, and it feels like we're on a trajectory where a lot of that is accelerating. There's more and more incidents being exposed. I think, this week, for instance, thanks to the word of the Citizen Lab, notably, we have one more example of an elected official who is now being told a government has purchased a third-party software in order to hack into your phone. The more we expose things like this, the more societies and individuals, and honestly, the also normal parts of a democratic societies like a party, start having these conversations saying, wait, are we actually on the front lines? I'll give you two more quick examples. I've worked a lot on the US government investigation of what really happened in 2016 with Russian interference. And I think that in many ways, the work that Congress did here was really significant and could be a fantastic best practice. And it hasn't happened in a lot of other countries, right? Congress said, we need to get to the bottom of this, and we need to get to the bottom of this publicly. We will ask the company provide the data from how this attack unfolded, and we will hire, researchers to study this data and encourage the data to be shared publicly. That made a huge impact on how we now understand foreign interference. It provided the first base of empirical evidence for what foreign interference looked like on social media. And in turn, it created a huge pressure for industry to react much more strongly to these types of threats. Another example that comes to mind, and I apologize in advance because it's really niche, but it's something that's close to my heart. There is a very small, often not discussed feature throughout Silicon Valley and most technology, consumer-facing technology companies, which is the only feature that currently exists where a technology company tells a user that they are being directly targeted by a government. It started in 2010 at Google with something called a state-sponsored warning, and it now has 10 years. It has been adopted throughout the industry. We, of course, still see Google do it, but Facebook does it, Twitter does it. And now we have sort of many different instances of individual users being told for the first time, hey, you are in the front lines of cyber conflict. Your own account, your own email is actually being targeted by a state actor. Not only can we see it, but we will tell you about it. And I think that sort of our maturity towards being able to have a conversation with people on the front lines about them being in this position and informing them and giving them the tools to respond and to analyze will make a real difference in whether or not we will see a movement of individuals who say, actually, peace and security, peace and stability in cyberspace does matter for democratic society. It matters for us.
Thank you so much for that. On to the next question by Catherine, who asks, defining cyber peace as collective responsibility to build peace in cyberspace risks falling into the tragedy of the commons. How do we navigate assigning responsibility given that developing and developed countries have power asymmetries and incentives? So essentially how to make sure that there's real responsibility and how does that look in the global perspective? Camille, do you want to start with this one or should I start with Stefan?
I don't unfortunately have much original thoughts on this one because I think it's a great question that applies to a lot of bodies of international law, and that here we kind of can hopefully rely on the types of institutions that have been able to create accountability in the past. I think that what's interesting in the context of cyber peace is this movement that now has a few years in which mostly there's been an agreement on the idea that the rules that apply offline and that apply in other domains will apply online and will help us create this type of accountability. And I think not starting from scratch, right? Starting with the existing set of legal frameworks and institution to then build on that to create a sense of accountability doesn't, as the question said, doesn't avoid the difficult questions that we know are often at play in international law, but creates a path forward.
Let me add to that and then turn to Stefan the following question, which I think ties to the previous one very well, which comes from Adik Shadouri. He asks, or I hope it's a male name, I'm sorry. The question is, how can political and nation-based diplomacy be distinguished from cyber diplomacy to ensure cyber peace? So what is really the difference between more traditional diplomacy and cyber diplomacy, which I think has a lot to do with the evolving field of responsibility and the relation between developed and developing countries? Stefan, any thoughts on that? What makes it specific? You've worked in international organization before. What makes the cyber diplomacy so distinct?
Yeah, to build on the question before and jumping in that one, the way we looked at cyber peace, not saying that it defines cyber peace, what I'm going to mention, but that is practically speaking how we look at it to propose some tangible solution. So it's a construct in between the technical reality of it, so the technical reality of the cyberspace, so the pipes, the protocol, the framework, as I was mentioning before. If one bit of this is changed, you are changing, in fact, the life of millions of people in one go, because the way we interface with the cyberspace is also defining what we can do, what cannot do, how fast we can do, with how many people, etc. So that's quite important. So that's the first body. The second is more looking at this from the human rights point of view. So what is your capacity to exerce your human rights in the cyberspace, to access this knowledge, to create this knowledge, and how this is aligned with the Charter of United Nations, etc. And the last one would be what is the bodies of norms and laws that are in that framework in order to put context around the first two. So when we look into specific projects or activities where we want to explain what is cyberspace, or to promote some behavior, or to go, and I like the example of Camille before with the work that Citizen Lab is doing, that is quite impressive when it comes to this analytics of specific irresponsible behavior. It's having these three assets in mind. So what did it do on the technical construct? Or what do we need to change on technical construct, at least to understand, because it facilitates this kind of attacks? What is the impact on the human rights? What is happening to human beings? And how does it fit with existing norms and law? What the example that you were mentioning before with the to-be checked statement from the US government for the CIA would be, if openly we say that we don't care about the norms that are saying that we should not attack, then it undermines the whole credibility of international law. So looking at this also from that point of view and bringing it back to the conversation. That's really how I would see looking into practically not focusing only on the tech or on the human rights or international law, but looking every time that we have an activity, how can we move all the parts all together to be really practical about this.
Thank you. Jumping to the next question from an anonymous attendee who asks, which countries have been surprising proponents or leaders in advancing cyber peace initiatives? Are there any, quote, dark horses that we should be paying attention to over the next 5 to 10 years? Interesting question. Who are the leaders here?
This is where we play scorecards, right?
Yeah, or just, like when you look at, when I look at the European scene, then it's clear that some smaller countries like Estonia, the Netherlands, Sweden have been particularly ambitious, but globally the picture may be different. I think it's a great question. I just think dark horses, we may have to think of them as sort of white horses or white doves in this field. Any thoughts? It can be brief. If it's not immediately a country that mind that we can jump on. Yeah, Camille.
The difficulty for me that comes to mind in answering this question is the norms conversation is taking a long time, to the point that in reality we've seen many different administrations in the different countries, right? And so I think it's true that on certain aspects we've seen clear leaders. The Netherlands have indeed invested a lot in making sure that there's a multi-stakeholder dialogue that happens around these questions. And then there are questions like the US. It's interesting because we've sort of seen different aspects, and honestly, different administrations sort of participate in this process throughout the years. the overall thing that makes it really interesting to track is, and this relates to the conversation around cyber diplomacy, right? Is at the end of the day, all these governments also tend to define the issue differently. They have a different institutional setup, and they sort of abide by their own rules. So let me, because I'm French, let me give you an example that's very French that I think is interesting on the global scene. France has a government policy to not do public attribution of cyber attacks. And so for the few high-level, well-known incidents that have targeted the country of France, the sort of like everybody kind of knows who were behind it because it's been reported on, because industry has made forensics report, but there is no formal acknowledgement by the government that they recognize who was the adversary, and there's no official attribution. Now, if you take that in mind, that makes it sometimes difficult and interesting to see how can you have a broader discussion around doing a diplomacy of accountability if some of the players kind of operate on different rules and abide by different principles.
Stefan, anything to add, or should we jump to the next question?
Yeah, very, very shortly. It's just going back also to the question in terms of advancing cyber peace initiatives, and go back to what Camille was saying. There you are into the definition of cyber peace by each and every country, what this means for them. If we speak about the stability of the cyberspace, meaning making sure that it's stable and controlled, then it can be a way to see cyber peace. Other countries can have totally different views when it comes to this. I would follow Camille there in terms of the investment of cyber diplomacy capacity is already something that shows a lot, and also the how the comments of these countries, mostly when you see, for example, in the open-ended working group set up, or the comments of these countries are going into, there was a question of before, the recognition of there's an accountability gap, proposing solutions about this, making sure that there's also going to unilateral pledges when it comes to, we say that we should not attack critical civil infrastructure in time of crisis, specifically the healthcare, and that's the way it is. So when you do that, you show the way. So yeah, you can think about, of course, the Netherlands was mentioned, Czech Republic, Australia, these kind of countries. And but again, it really depends on which part of the cyber peace initiative you're focusing on. So yeah.
Thank you. Another question from Paul Meyer, who asks, inspired by the Human Rights Council's Universal Periodic Review mechanism, ICT for Peace has proposed a state peer review mechanism for those states possessing offensive cyber operations capacities. Do you think this UN institutional precedent can help gain acceptance within the cybersecurity community? And I think this question is so interesting given what we just discussed in terms of the US going for more offensive capabilities and a sign off on that apparently for the CIA by Trump. Is there a way to build in, is how I read this question, checks and sort of deliberations short of being 100% transparent about those very sensitive areas? It's also an academic concept, of course, peer review. So I think a lot of people listening here from the Stanford community will recognize it. Does it have a chance?
Are we allowed to ask for your opinions on the matter? Because I know that you've worked a lot on these questions and you've seen many different sort of political accountability mechanisms. So on this one, I'm actually really curious to see what your assessment is, which I realize this is not what you're supposed to do as a panelist, but I have to ask, given your expertise on this issue.
Are you hacking the panel?
No, I'm sorry. This is not an information operation. You're all on the phone lines.
No, I'm happy to share some thoughts. I mean, I think that any kind of added checks and balances is a benefit. So if for sensitivity or lack of trust reasons, which I've seen enough politics to know that that's real. I mean, even within the European Union, where mutual dependence is significant, there's a lack of trust, for example, when it comes to sharing intelligence. So even though the ideal might be having better oversight and better institutions, as long as those don't exist, I can well imagine that in smaller groups of trusted nations, there would be discussions. I'm sure it happens informally, but maybe it can be formalized a little bit. And then I think from such procedures, if they end up working well, norms may emerge. Because sometimes, because of practice and new ways of solving problems, a sort of new status quo or a critical mass of like-minded actors may step forward and then try to engage others to say, look, this has worked well for us. What also came to mind, which is obviously not the same, but it shows how this kind of cooperation with like-minded countries can go, is when you look at the Five Eyes cooperation between intelligence services. Now, I don't know if that leads to more checks and balances or rather to more alignment and strategic cooperation. My thoughts of encouraging these processes were more about increasing oversight, which I think is too often lacking, especially if there is a void in national or international law between the practice and sometimes the need to keep up with the technological change and how it impacts state interests and fundamental rights, as you mentioned, Camille, so important. So the question is, short of having international agreement or large-scale agreement between, let's say, democratic nations, which I think is a model that should be pursued, a democratic governance model of technologies. But until we have that, and these are lengthy processes, I think smaller scale cooperation, when it actually entails review and openness for critical thinking and learning, would be a step in the right direction.
Just to react on that, if you allow me, Marietje, there's also a question of, I guess, of pace of the different processes, because if you see the time that it takes GG, Open Working Group for states, just to discuss and come to draft comments agreement, looking into something that would be linked to that process with states-based review, that would be as fast as I read, like is 1 year review, something like this, would be quite complicated, I guess, to implement. And also on the basis of which data. So what are we going to review? So that's going to be a self-declaration of state, I did that and that's the way I behave. So how are we going to access the data behind? I think it's a very interesting idea, and I would like to go into the details of it with discussing, for example, the city for peace in terms of the pool of data. How are we going to put that all together, and how are we going to be sure that it's grounded into, and then go back to the opening, to what is happening really in the field from the point of view of impact to civilian population, and hard evidence that if there's a review, why not by state or others, we know it's reviewed against what, and that the methodology is really transparent. So that would be the comment.
Thank you so much. I want to jump to the remaining questions before we wrap up in the next 10 minutes. So Larry Diamond, hi Larry, thanks for joining, a colleague at the Cyber Policy Center and a well-known expert on democracy, asks the following. What theories, principles, and lessons of conflict prevention and deterrence in the physical world are relevant in the cyber domain? Who wants to start? Camille?
Yeah, that's the million-euro question. There's been a lot of hypotheses on deterrence and escalation in cyberspace, and here it's a little bit of chicken and egg problem because of what Stefan said, right? Because we actually lack a lot of the evidence base to do a proper, like, well-informed assessment of escalatory dynamics in that field. There have been a few attempts by scholars of cyber conflict to sort of get us away from projections of how we think escalation may or may not work, and again to have an assessment that's more data-based and grounded in empirical evidence. And I think we're sort of starting to get there, but to be honest, I think the answer to that is we don't know, and we haven't had a lot of available empirical data points in order to have a level-headed assessment of how escalatory dynamics actually play out in cyberspace.
Stefan, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, very quickly. It's I agree with Camille. I mean, when it comes to deterrence and similarities and difference, there's a lot of difference that we can list for sure. What we can learn from that is not that clear, but it's also a question of point of view or how we want to address the issue of cyber peace. So deterrence would be a way, but we choose to focus on accountability for the fact that we can break it down into activities that are much more practical. And for what Camille was saying in the opening, meaning that it's a framework where we can really involve a lot of stakeholders in order to reach the goal. So looking at that also from if it's complicated to see what lesson learned from other fields when it comes to deterrence can help in the cyber context, let's focus into something that we can at least describe and promote better operationally, like accountability.
Thank you for that. We're coming to the end of this webinar, and I have a question that is increasingly occupying my mind that I want to end with, and also invite you to share some last thoughts if you feel like we've missed on a key aspect of cyber peace or something that people can do that can empower them right now. Feel free to throw it in. But the question I have is the following. When we look at the broader process of digitization, not only all the benefits and the value that is created, but also the new threats and risks that emerge, we see an extraordinary role for private companies. In many ways, they have a larger governing role, either by the technologies they develop or the strength of their markets through their business models, or by creating products that are simply unregulated. We just talked about hacking as a service that has been used against European politicians most recently, but against human rights defenders much before. Is there a risk to cyber peace or a risk of escalation merely as a result of this growing governance and also offensive and defensive power that is going from the hands of the state, let's assume democratic states for the example in this question, where there's checks and balances and oversight and where there's legitimacy, into commercially driven entities where such frameworks and institutions and principles are lacking? Happy to start with Camille and then end with Stefan, and then I'll say two final thoughts before we say goodbye.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and I think that it plays across the entire spectrum of our conversation. On the one hand, we have seen a proliferation of businesses that are now sort of like for-hire cyber mercenaries and who do play an active role in cyber conflict, including in sort of the escalation that we're seeing and the harm towards individuals and civil society. How do we regulate the sort of market of cyber mercenary, right? I know it's a question that you worked a lot on. I know that it's extraordinarily difficult and we don't seem to be making as much progress as we should, but that's an important question, which is, let's acknowledge that the entities who participate in the development of, I hate the term cyber weapons, but the development of what is leveraged in cyber conflict and in the deployment of that isn't just government. There is also a market in the middle of that, and that market ought to be regulated. And on the other side of the spectrum, there's a more proactive conversation that has to do with huge industry players who have a lot of visibility into how cyber conflict unfolds and who have the ability, if they decide to exercise it, to stop some of these instances of cyber conflict and to better protect their users, their individuals who use their services from being targeted in this context. And this is sort of like back to the point I was making about the state-sponsored warnings and all the other ways in which we can see industry being proactive in both informing of potential threats they're seeing and helping people defend themselves. And so I think here the role of private companies, I know you want us to wrap quickly, so I'll end there, but there's a lot that can be done both on the regulation side and also on the proactive side. And I've been very encouraged by seeing major companies commit to taking proactive responsibilities to build to build cyber peace and to sort of preserve peace and stability in cyberspace. I think that's a very new and noteworthy development. Now, how they're going to actually do this in practice, we'll see. I think there's still like a lot of meat that needs to go on these bones to explain what does it look like to have a good and proactive role here. But their commitment and the fact that this is now a conversation is really encouraging.
Yeah, building on what Camille was saying, I totally agree. If I go back to the years where I was refocusing on cyber criminal groups into analyzing their behavior and investigating their operations, in a lot of cases, you were discovering that the tool set that they were using, or the know-how, the expertise, was engineered several months or years before by state actors. And sometime in the middle of the chain, too many times, in fact, you had an industry that specialized itself into the delivery of such capabilities. So that was just a reality in the whole chain of the attack. How to address that? We go back to this accountability framework, meaning that there's some expectation towards stakeholders, all the stakeholders that are accessing the cyberspace and using it to make money, for market, etc. There should be expectation. And if the activity is going so against the concept of cyber peace and is an accelerator of attacks left and right in the world, for sure there should be regulation, and in the sense that regulators need to look into it, but also there's a huge space for industry proactively to take stance and to decide what they want to do or not. I mean, there's a lot of technology that were looked into inoffensive at some point in their life, and then suddenly everyone is like waking up and, oh, what did we do? Just take face recognition. It's an easy example. Why would that be different for the fact of putting in place a piece of codes that have the sole purpose to undermine the security of the cyberspace?
Thank you. I think it's a very powerful point to end on, that these technologies emerge, and there's a need to apply scrutiny to understand it better and to look at what the worst possible outcomes could be, who could be harmed that's already vulnerable, and not only to look at sort of how to mitigate security risks or advancing innovation. There's a lot more we could talk about, but we won't have time for that today. The next Cyber Policy Center webinar will be on July 29th. The topic will still be revealed. Sometimes we jump on current affairs. Like yesterday, we had a Stop Hate for Profit campaign discussion, and I'm sure there will be another hot topic by July 29th. So look for that. I want to begin by thanking our team at the Cyber Policy Center that works really hard behind the scenes, invisibly but very efficiently, to get this all to run smoothly. So thanks a lot, David, Michelle, but also everyone behind the scenes that has been involved. Thank you all for joining, and particularly a big thank you for Camille and Stéphane. It was great to have your expert views and your real life examples here on the table for discussion. And from the questions that were invited, I think there is a lot of appetite for cyber peace, but a big quest on how to get there. So we will need multiple people to engage and to come on board on the cyber peace agenda. And I think the relevance has been underlined once again today. So thanks a lot, and enjoy the rest of your day wherever you might be in the world. Bye-bye.